Thank you, Michelle, and wanted to thank John Dirks and the organizers from the Canada Gairdner Foundation, and congratulate King. I think I'm the one speaker today that's one generation removed from King in terms of mentorship. My first scientific mentor was Bob Brunham, who had been mentored by King in Seattle, and I kept on hearing about King Holmes and all of the ways in which he'd influenced the way people thought. But it's over the last 10 or 15 years I've gotten to know King, and he truly is an inspiring character, and particularly I think the way he assimilates knowledge from different areas. He's I won't say a sponge because that doesn't sound quite elevated enough, but he integrates, he's an integrator. He integrates information and comes up with new ideas. So it's not a surprise that he came up with MARP before a lot of people were talking, or HARP before a lot of people were talking about combination prevention. So I'm going to talk about program science and addressing the academic mission in global health. And it may sound as though this is something new, but I think if you listen, as you listen to the talk, what you realize is what I'm really doing is rethinking and repackaging what a lot of people have already been talking about today. It's really something that is inherent in people who are problem solvers, people who've been involved in academia or in science and have tried to solve problems. But I think what I'd like to suggest is that we need to be more diligent and more organized in our efforts to try to close the gap between programs and science, that we need to make this an area of deliberate activity. So I'm going to start, and some of you will probably already know the answer to this question, but I'm going to start with a question that I'll then answer later on, because it is sort of central to this whole concept of program science. So who is this man, and why did he visit our academic center in October 2009? So you can stay tuned for the answer on that. So when we think about the academic mission, and I'm talking now from the perspective of somebody who works in an academic institution, here's the mission of our university. I bet it's not very different from the mission of most universities or colleges. Our mission is to create, preserve, and communicate knowledge, and thereby contribute to cultural, social, and economic well-being of the people of Manitoba, Canada, and the world. And so the idea here, written into the role of academia, is to not only develop knowledge, but this imperative really to communicate and use that knowledge to serve the wider community in all aspects of the world. And it really does fit with what John Last says is the definition of public health. It's to contribute to the combination of skills, sciences, et cetera, that improve the health of all of the people. So the idea here, I think, that I'm trying to portray is that academic institutions should embrace this mission of not only creating the knowledge, but then thinking about how that knowledge is going to actually improve things. And I think we have, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that and some of the constraints on that. So if we decode the academic mission, we could sort of parse it into the knowledge and the application. So from a knowledge perspective, academic institutions and scientists focus a lot on scientific discovery and synthesizing the knowledge from various realms of scientific discovery. And then increasingly, we are trying to translate this knowledge into application to affect health policy, to improve the application in public health programs. So there's implicitly within the academic mission this idea of generating the knowledge and then translating it and thereby actually changing the way things are done, particularly in this case in the area of public health. And if we take this more specifically to HIV and STIs, we realize that science focuses a lot on developing these preventive interventions, and it's been a wonderful day of learning about the history of the development of a response, a scientific response to HIV, from the discovery of the virus to the discovery of different ways to treat the virus, to different ways to prevent the virus, and different ways for combining prevention and treatment. And so we've really understood this virus. I think Mike put it well, that we understand more from the science basis about this virus than just about anything else. We've really understood this virus, and we've developed a lot of efficacious interventions. And this is something that I think science takes a lot of credit for and should take a lot of credit for. We've really done an excellent job of developing interventions. And we've stuck, for the most part, through this whole process to what I would call a research-driven approach to intervention design and assessment. So when we think about our programs, our intervention programs, whether it's at a state level or a national level or at a global level, we really have been sticking to the research-driven approach to things, trying to get evidence into practice. So we start with this theoretical basis. We understand how to stop the virus from being transmitted from one person to another. We then use that to design an intervention. It could be TASP, it could be PrEP, it could be condoms. There's a variety of different interventions. We then demonstrate its efficacy or effectiveness through clinical research, clinical trials. And then once we have that evidence, we implement and we try to scale that up with fidelity. We want to maintain fidelity with the design. We don't want to do a lot of deviation because we want to make sure that what we're implementing is what we've tested. And so this is really the research-driven model to how we scale up all of our scientific discoveries. And we've seen a whole slide's worth of different interventions. But I think we have to recognize that there are real constraints to the research-driven model, particularly in public health. First of all, it often ignores the heterogeneity of epidemiological context. So we set the wrong priorities within a given context. So just because something is efficacious, we want to implement that regardless of what the context is. So just because we have the effectiveness really drives the solution because we have so few of these proven effective interventions. And this often results in the emphasis on single interventions, regardless of the relative impact. So we choose the wrong interventions in different places. And I think it too often focuses on the science of the technology rather than the science of program development and scale-up. So we're thinking a lot about what the intervention is without thinking about how this intervention can be actually implemented and scaled up. Mike talked about how Chairman Mao did. He had a particular method for scaling something up. But I think that, but too often, we're not thinking enough about what the right program model is to scale up these interventions. And I think that this is a real constraint of the research-driven model. A lot of these kinds of ideas came together, and when we were bumping along on a dusty road in India at one time, Sev Ghiarel and I were talking about these challenges. How do we understand? How do you effectively integrate our scientific knowledge into a program to actually have an impact? And out of that came this notion of program science. It's the idea of the systematic application of theoretical and empirical scientific knowledge to improve the design, implementation, and evaluation of public health programs. It's amazing how this late in the day we thought that it was important to actually capture this concept because it should be sort of inbred within us. But we felt that too often we weren't seeing the link between science and what we know and the application. There's this gulf between the knowledge and the application. So when we think about this in the context of HIV and STD prevention, we can think about it in terms of three areas. And these three areas are not research areas. These three areas are program areas. So if we think about the program areas in which program science can be applied, we can think of it in terms of strategic planning. So strategic planning is really making sure you have your priorities correctly and that you're putting your resources where they're going to have the most impact. For this, science needs to help us understand epidemics and particularly understand concentrations within epidemics and the key populations within that context. We need to understand program implementation, and we need to contribute to program implementation by coming up with the right selection of an intervention mix, by tailoring the interventions to the local context. These are all really important things for programs, and science needs to be there to help with this process, to contribute to this process. And then there's a whole area of program management. So looking at system models for scaling up, looking at how best to monitor and impact and monitor and look at the impact evaluation for programs so that we can actually contribute to the fine-tuning of programs. So these are domains in which we work. And if we repackage that information for STIs and HIV, we can think about the issues for optimizing the intervention impact. So if we start with strategic planning, we need to have really robust methods for appraising epidemics. So we really understand who is most important, where is most important, and what we should be delivering. So this idea of understanding the epidemic really is going to contribute to the strategic planning so we can optimize our resource allocation. But then even if we have the right strategy, we have the challenge of implementation. And this is where a lot of the implementation research comes in. So how can we optimize the effectiveness and efficiency of a given strategy? How do we improve coverage? How do we improve quality? How do we maximize synergy with the rest of the health system and with other interventions? So we have these dual challenges. On the one hand, we have strategic planning, and on the other, implementation. And science has to play a role in each of these areas. So if we get back to the somewhat rhetorical question, are we moving forward? I'm going to talk about it in terms of two domains, just as an illustration of some of the program science challenges. One is understanding epidemics. Are we moving forward in terms of understanding epidemics? And point out that this has historically been a main challenge for people in public health, is understanding epidemics. So here we go back to the early 1800s, when it was felt that cholera was generated through miasma, through bad air or night air. This notion that this was the cause of the epidemic, and most people at that time really truly believed that this is what was causing cholera. And we had dueling scientists who were thinking about this. We had William Farr, who was an excellent statistician, who supported the place theory of cholera epidemics. And he used really persuasive statistical analysis to suggest that this was what was happening. John Snow, on the other hand, really, I think if you look at it, integrated sociological, biomedical, and statistical principles and insights to try to investigate the epidemic. So he wanted to dig beneath the surface. He didn't accept the received wisdom that this was due to bad air, but he tried to understand what were the ways in which this was being transmitted. And they both came up with their statistical evidence. And so you have William Farr's table here from 1852. I think any student of public health these days would say these are really compelling data. So he looked at the rate of cholera in relation to the elevation above the River Thames. And what he found was an incredibly strong dose response curve. And it was very strong evidence for this notion that the further away you got from the airs or the miasma along the river, the higher your cholera rate was. Now, John Snow looked at it in a different way. He looked at it at a different way of looking at things spatially. And he was looking for a different model and trying to understand the epidemic differently. And he came up with a more effective solution. You might have been able to get the same solution following Farr if you moved everybody far enough away from the pump. But at the end of the day, this was a more insightful way of analyzing the data. Both of them very compelling statistical evidence, but one of them closer to what a program would need to know in order to come up with a solution. So where are we in HIV? And how much progress have we made? So there's a lot of emphasis now on this know your epidemic. But there's diverse concepts for defining and describing epidemics. And I think there's inconsistent approaches to planning prevention based on these methods. And I think the other challenge we have is most often there's a lack of data to accurately appraise the epidemic. So even if we have the right methodologies, we often have the wrong data. And I'll try to illustrate both of those. So let's think about different ways of appraising or describing an STI or HIV epidemic. We can describe it in terms of amplitude, incidence or prevalence. And then we can translate that into epidemic typologies. Is this a concentrated epidemic with a low prevalence? Is it a generalized epidemic with high prevalence? We can look at trajectories. Where is this in terms of its temporal stage? We can look at transmission dynamics, behavioral and subpopulation drivers of the epidemic. We can look at it from the perspective of underlying determinants. What are the socioeconomic drivers of the epidemic? We can also look at it from the perspective of geography or concentration, and we can describe the epidemic that way. Now, all of these have been generated, but the problem for program planners is how does this help them make decisions? We have all of these different methods, but which of these can translate into something that will help them come up with an effective policy? And I think we haven't been assiduous enough in translating these different appraisal methods. So here's some examples. One of my favorite papers still, and a paper by Judy Wasserheit and Sev Gheorel looking at the phases of STD epidemics. It captures so many different concepts of the growth of an STD epidemic, from the idea of amplitude to the idea of phases, but also this notion of the host population focus and concentration. So we need to have these kinds of we need to be able to translate these kinds of notions into real program planning. We have what I would call some false starts. So here we have the modes of transmission study. The modes of transmission over the last 5 years have become the dominant method for appraising and describing epidemics globally. But then we're now finding that we're coming up with some fairly perverse results and perverse conclusions, and we're now driving these into policy. So you can see the modes of transmission study from Uganda has apparently found that HIV is essentially not a sexually transmitted infection, because we find that the largest number of new infections are occurring in mutually monogamous heterosexual sex. And so this may be true, but it's irrelevant for HIV prevention because it's looking at just a snapshot of infections that are occurring over a very short period of time without looking at the upstream infections. How did the discordant couple become discordant? And in fact, you'll see the implications of this modes of transmission study resulted in banners that said things like marriage is the highest risk for HIV. Those kinds of things got translated. This is 30 years after the epidemic started. We're still contributing to this misspecification of the epidemic through these studies. But we also have bad data. So even if you like the modes of transmission approach to categorizing epidemics, you can see that it really depends on the data you have. So Holly Pruden and colleagues have shown that the initial modes of transmission study from Nigeria showed that 73% of infections occurred within the low-risk general population. But that was because the data they had was wrong. They didn't have any data on discordant couples. They didn't have accurate data on the size of the most at-risk populations. And so when they remodeled the study, just putting in different parameters for behaviors and population subdistribution, they came up with a completely different distribution of new infections by subpopulation. So we have to be really cautious when we're developing the science to actually be giving useful information for programs, because otherwise we're going to be leading countries astray. I think the other problem that we have is we are not applying ourselves at the right scales. So I love this quote from Borges. Anybody who's lived or worked in India agrees with this completely. India is larger than the world. And from a perspective of HIV versus the global response, it's actually pretty true. Because if you look at the global pandemic of HIV, you can see that, you have great swaths of territory that have similar prevalence. But really the challenge is the heterogeneity within countries and even below country levels within states. So if we start thinking about the pandemic as different regions of the world, we'll make huge errors in terms of how we respond to the epidemic, because it's a much too crude a way of classifying the epidemic. So if you start going down to the district level in India, you get a much clearer picture of things. And we're seeing that increasingly over time. We're starting to be much better at looking at the specificity of the epidemic within a country. So here's an example from a paper that looked at HIV clustering in Burkina Faso. Some of you might have seen this paper on the macro level spatial clustering of HIV in Tanzania, where the authors looked at the at high prevalent zones versus low prevalent zones, and they found that only 14% of the population resides in high HIV prevalence geographic clusters. So this kind of information is much more valuable than trying to give a general statement about the epidemic in a country like this has a generalized epidemic. And so I think we increasingly need to move to the types of analysis or appraisal of epidemics that's going to be useful for program planning. But we can go even further down than that, and I think increasingly we must do this. If we're going to be really effective at implementing programs on the ground, we need to look at where risk is clustering. It's really not effective to say that we want to reach the general population in a city or in the rural areas of a country, because we can't. It's really difficult to have effective programs by knocking on people's doors in a city. You can't say we're going to reach the general population in Lagos. It doesn't make sense. So we have to think about where are we going to reach them. And so there's some very interesting work that's been done that shows that you can reach these subpopulations from the general population where they congregate to find new sexual partners. So here there's a paper by Kalichman and colleagues that concluded that alcohol-serving venues in South Africa are high-risk settings, and they suggested that you could really focus here. And we found the same thing in several other places globally. I'll just look at my time. are we moving forward in terms of implementation? So even if we understand the epidemic, are we able to move forward in implementation? And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just to point out that efficacy, in order to change things globally, has to be converted into effectiveness and impact on the ground. So we have here moving from an intervention that's probably, it might even be 100% efficacious actually. But when we see on the ground in countries like South Africa, which is high performing and in the African setting, and China, which has a lot of resources in the Asian setting, we're still finding that we have a lot of challenges for implementation. So in South Africa, there was a study that showed that 30% of people who said that they were on antiretroviral therapy were found to have high viral load. And we find in China that where they've implemented treatment as prevention, they found that, and this was in the context of discordant couples, about a 26% reduction in HIV transmission in discordant couples against gold standard efficacy of almost 100%. So there's we're running into these challenges in implementation, even when we have the right strategy, and even if it's being applied in the right populations. So if we think about something as elegant and as important as treatment as prevention, we still have a lot of challenges to go forward to move to impact. So at a strategic level, we need to think about population, geographic, and population and geographic prioritization. This idea of if we're going to deploy this, where should we deploy it first? Where will we get the first and highest impact? We have to look at treatment criteria. We have to look at coverage. A lot of modeling has been done on treatment as prevention that suggests that it's not just the overall coverage, but how quickly you achieve coverage that makes a difference. And so we have to think a little bit about, if we're going to implement this, are we going to sort of grumble into it over 5 or 10 years, or are we going to get to saturation as quickly as possible? These are very important questions. And in terms of implementation, we need to think about the diagnostic and treatment methods, and we really need to optimize the implementation, the testing, the linkage, the retention and adherence. So this whole idea of maintaining that cascade, I think, is a huge challenge. So I'm going to get back to this question, and I'm going to answer it for you. So who is this man? His name is Governor Soswam. He's the governor of Benue State in Nigeria. And he visited our center in 2009 with a message. He said that the HIV epidemic was unabated in Benue State. He'd been the governor for a long time. He said that there'd been huge investments in HIV in the state, both by his health system as well as by foreign donors and by the national program. He had seen no change in HIV prevalence in the last 15 years. And he was seeking knowledge from an academic center about how to address the epidemic. How he came to our center was, he told me later, was that he looked up Google and he found our university and he was in Canada, so he thought he would, he was on a trade mission, I think, and he thought he would stop by. And Alan Ronald was in the meeting with us, and I think Alan knows how I sort of squirmed and tried to avoid committing to going, because he said he would pay for a delegation from our university to come and do an assessment of his epidemic. He wanted an academic view of what's happening in his epidemic. Well, it's a long story from there. This is his state. We did go there after weekly reminders from him and his staff. And growing out of that was a program science initiative that's been supported by the World Bank's Global HIV and AIDS program. And in this program, what we're doing, not just in Benue, but in 7 other states, is doing state-level epidemiological syntheses to try to understand the epidemic, local epidemic appraisals to help target programs, implementation support on helping tailor the interventions. And this is meant to really help the overall impact of their program. We've organized it along some basic themes. So looking at how to optimize programs for most at-risk populations in the center, other vulnerable key populations, people engaging in casual sex, and people who are linked to most at-risk populations, and then more broadly in the general population. So there's a framework that we've developed for doing the appraisals and organizing the response. The appraisals have been done in 8 states. They're now going to be done in most of the other states. So we've done things like mapping and estimating the size of the sex worker population in different places. In each of the urban areas, we've actually mapped out the venues of sex workers so that programs can focus their interventions accordingly. We've improved the granularity and we think the accuracy of behavioral data. We were surprised there was an epidemic in Nigeria because everybody's circumcised and nobody has sex. And this was based on all of the previous behavioral surveys. So about, I think, 0.3% of women had ever had more than one partner in the last year. Almost none of the men ever visited sex workers, so it was almost impossible. The modelers sort of threw up their hands and said, we can't generate an epidemic here because of the behavioral data. But it's because of the way that they gathered the data. So we actually used voting booth surveys, as Patty Garcia suggested. And what we found was very high levels of risk, and particularly high levels of risk in Governor Suswam's state, Benue. So you can see that if we look at married and unmarried females, 35 to over 45% of them said that they had more than one sex partner in the past 6 months. So very high rates of partner change when previously they'd been told through the DHS surveys that there was basically no multi-partner sex in the rural areas. The other thing we found is that in the high prevalence places, a very high percentage of the patrons that were visiting these venues, bars and clubs, were actually there seeking sexual partners. And this was particularly true in the high prevalence areas. So a place like Benue, about almost 40% of the patrons that were visiting there that we surveyed said that they were there to find new sexual partners. So these became areas. So now what we were able to do is we were able to differentiate between the states. So you look at Benue State versus Ondo State, which has a low prevalence. You can see much higher levels of risk. And we're now translating this into differentiated programs in the states. Before that, the states essentially had the same programs. It was a national model, and they weren't differentiating. So what we're doing with the national government now is helping them with the National Prevention Plan, helping them with implementation guidelines, and also even getting down to the specifics of developing terms of reference for implementers. Which geographic focus, what are the coverage targets, what are the intervention components, what's the measurement framework for the program. So going forward, what do we need to advance program science? So I think first we actually need a renewed vision for public health science. We might need what could be termed a third epidemiological revolution that really refocuses on defining and understanding epidemics. I think we've run to the limit of our methods so far, and I don't think we're moving the field forward anymore. I think we need to really assiduously work on this idea of embedded scientists. I think this idea of staying in the university, doing research, and then bringing the research to programs, it doesn't work. And I don't think it's going to work. I think we've had, in the HIV field, I think we've seen that again and again and again. We need to develop learning platforms. One of the things that I was really impressed with when I was a student was all of the presentations from MATLAB. And I think that we need to think more about how we can build learning platforms so we can actually learn about epidemics. I'm not just talking about randomized community trials and getting all the data we can from randomized community trials. I'm talking about catchment area programs that in multiple places that are linked together to share knowledge. And I think we need to build knowledge networks to really accelerate knowledge around programs and around the science of programs. A couple of challenging terms. I'm an epidemiologist, so a couple of challenging papers if you're interested. So here's one by a couple of professors at Johns Hopkins University. Epidemiology is being dragged kicking and screaming towards complexity and contingent causation. We really need to think more about the complexity of epidemics rather than our old tools. And a professor from Johns Hopkins University, it is only unfortunate that one must explicitly and continuously note the relationship of epidemiology with public health. For without public health, there is no epidemiology. I'm going to stop there. Thanks.